Welcome to the Postpartum Performance Podcast. If you're here to be empowered and encouraged, you're in the right place. I believe every woman deserves to learn who's in her corner, which is why this podcast was created, to share encouragement and intentional conversations around women's health, nutrition, and wellness for new mothers. In each episode, we will discuss ways for women to find truth for her health, to feel strong, and to be confident from the inside out. I'm your host, Dr. Lindsay Peczkowski, a performance physical therapist with a passion for teaching others about pelvic health and guiding mothers to build movement, confidence, and strength. I'm a lover of running and weightlifting and a healthy cooking enthusiast. All right, ladies, grab your coffee and settle in for an episode of the Postpartum Performance Podcast. Are you with me? Here we go. Welcome back to the Postpartum Performance Podcast. Today, I'm going to be talking about half marathon training from the PT's perspective. So at the start of 2020, I decided I wanted to run another half marathon. I had gotten into long distance running during college and in undergrad. I started with a 5K, Brian's Run, for those of you familiar with that from Carroll University. And I became hooked with the ability to push my limits, explore the college town I was in, and get some stress relief. Since then, I've run 6 half marathons, which this most recent one was my 6th, and then I've also run a marathon. Each time I've decided to commit to training for a race, my goals would change. So from the first half marathon, the goal was just to complete the race in under 2 hours. And on some of my later races, my goal was to cross-train more than actually increasing my running mileage. I've had many of you reaching out asking about what my training program looked like, what I did, what I ate, and how I felt. So today I'll be sharing some of my tips for training for a half marathon and how to actually enjoy the process. So by saying over the past 4 years, I hadn't run longer distances than more than 3 to 4 miles. And I personally was just not excited to do long runs. You know how sometimes you just get to that point where certain types of training or exercise you're just not into? That was me for the past couple of years. So I was more interested in weight training at the time. So when I decided to train for another half marathon, I was basically starting back at square one for rebuilding my kind of running foundation and building up that mileage. The last 3 half marathons that I have run, I had focused more on my strength training and cross training to feel strong and confident in my runs, and not necessarily the training plan that some people would technically think of if they were going to be training for a longer distance race. So I chose to base my training off of a Hal Higgin program, which I'd done in the past. I chose his Intermediate 2 program, which is focused more on speed, and it was a 12-week training program. My goal for this race was I wanted to cut my time and push my limits. I knew I'd be able to complete the distance. I felt confident with that. And it was more about the mental challenge of pushing myself, pushing my pace rather than resorting to more of a comfortable pace that I would tend to do in general when I was running, and knowing that I was going to do a longer run. I kind of had that comfortable pace that I would enjoy, but I was wanting to kind of push my limits this time. So I chose to work on some of that speed work because that can make me feel a little uncomfortable in a good way and challenging me. So I was really going to kind of embrace and lean in on that. So the main components to this program included easy runs 2 to 3 times a week with distances that varied from 3 to 5 miles, long runs that started at 5 miles and worked their way up to 12 miles on the program. I personally chose not to go longer than 10 because I felt like I didn't need to go that close to the full race distance with my training. There was speed work, which was a new part of the training for me as I was trying to do more of that speed training and quicken my pace. And that would include tempo runs. And tempo runs are basically you're doing a continuous run with a building up to, for them, they had recommended up to your 10K race pace. But basically starting slow, ramping up to the pace that you want to be at, and then slowly going down towards the end of that distance. It also included intervals every other week, and it'd be running for 400 meters and that would be at your 5K pace. So pretty quick if you're thinking about trying to keep at those paces. Mind you, when I first started, I didn't have a different pace at all. So don't feel like you should really know exactly what your 5K pace is or a 10K pace. For me, it was more like, okay, I need to go faster for some of those 5K pace intervals. But the repeats would start from 5 and then worked up their way up to 10. So some weeks it was, 6 400-meter repeats, and making sure that you give yourself enough rest time in between. I would try to do at least twice the time that it took me to complete that distance. So I think it was about a minute and a half or so. So I would make sure that I'd give myself at least 3 minutes of rest in between the intervals to keep my legs fresh, give me time for recovery, and to actually allow for me to push the next interval and not just being completely exhausted and just trying to kind of keep going. That's not the point of the intervals. The recovery is a really important part of that. So personally for me, I can sprint and I can do long duration running, but that middle range for me with that speed work was really pushing me out of my comfort zone. And it also allowed me though to quicken my pace for the goal pace that I wanted for the race. So interval training, if you're trying to get some more speed or shorten down that pace time, definitely consider that to kind of sprinkle that into your training. The program that I followed was also designated to have 1 day for cross training. Given my history with weight training and my interest in continuing to strength train throughout, I had actually 3 days a week for cross training. I honestly believe that was my saving grace. When I initially started training, I was experiencing some left knee pain, which that can be discouraging and frustrating for anyone, let alone for me as a physical therapist. That was really frustrating to have any pain while running or doing any exercise. So rather than giving up though and just saying like, oh, maybe I'll just like try that next year and not train or not push myself the way that I wanted to, I had my husband Dave help revamp my cross training for some of the areas that I needed some more strength, mobility, and stability, and reduced my miles to for about 2 weeks to less than 4 mile runs. So by working with him and providing some better strength exercises specific to me, that consistency with those exercises that he prescribed and that I was able to do with my cross training, I was able to eliminate that knee pain and prevail throughout the program without any symptoms. So I highly recommend working with a coach. Even myself with the background that I have, it's very different when it's your own body. And so I found it really helpful to have Dave help kind of guide that and steer my training, because as much as I know my weaknesses, I also sometimes avoid those areas, and he was able to help program those in a good way and a safe way so that I could continue to run. So the beauty of running programs such as the one that I followed is that it gives you a really easy layout to follow and a framework. So I used it more as a framework, and I tweaked things and I adjusted to the needs and the design that I wanted and the frequency that I wanted. So I changed some of those cross-training days and when I did my long runs and whatnot. So I chose to do my long runs on Mondays, cross-training on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and then Wednesdays were my low mileage runs. Fridays were for speed work with the intervals or tempo runs. And then Sunday was a full rest recovery day. So if you're just starting out, I would recommend following some of those plans pretty close. That can be really helpful to actually follow the plans and just have that consistency and something to guide your training. But if you're interested in starting to run and train for longer mileage, I would be more than happy to help you provide some insight and guidance on a running program to follow in addition to strength training that can build a foundation to be resilient in your running program and increase your mileage. That pretty much completes what the details were regarding some of the X's and O's of my training program that I was following this past summer. And I chose to do mostly road running, primarily with a few dirt trails and then some beach runs sprinkled in when I just wanted to switch things up. But for the most part, I was doing road running because that was what I was planning on running for the race. So Before each run, I would complete a series of warm-up activation exercises to prepare myself for my run. And this included hip mobility drills, ankle mobility drills, and some exercises to activate my glutes and core, as well as some single leg exercises for some more hip stability. And I know that some runners think, geez, that must have been taking you forever to do that before your runs. I know a lot of people, I've caught myself with using my first mile as my warm-up. But really it took 5 to 10 minutes, and if that. And by doing that, it actually helped prepare my body, and I felt stronger in my runs, and I was able to avoid those overuse injury progressions, and able to really dial in on what my body needed to not also have any like extreme soreness or anything like that after my long runs. So after the runs, I would make sure to do a cool down walk, especially after the intervals and runs, if I was really pushing my pace. And I would also complete some stretching flow sequence kind of yoga style things, focusing on breathing and lower body and chest stretches to aid also recovery. Being really mindful of that breathing to get back into your parasympathetic, especially when you're pushing yourself on pushing your limits, you're going to get more into your sympathetic or kind of that heightened state of the nervous system. And so being able to dial back in on the parasympathetic is really important for stress management as well. So I wanted to talk also about the cross training. So I mentioned it earlier, but I wanted to go a little bit more in depth on what some of the cross training would look like for me. So I'm just going to talk you through a snapshot of my cross training workouts and what they looked like. So most of them, each one would actually start with some sort of rehab exercises specific to me. Again, how I mentioned my knee had been bothering me when I first started training. So these were focusing on some mobility and strengthening and some other activation exercises while warming up. And then 2 of the 3 cross training days that I was doing, I would follow up with strength training. So 2 of the days out of the 3. And that was usually a movement like a barbell back squat or a hex bar or a barbell deadlift, and some other plyometrics followed right after that to work on more of that explosiveness after a heavy lift with that. There's more research regarding kind of how that training can help with more of those fast twitch and muscle strengthening exercises. So after that, the end of the cross training days would include some sort of strength circuit. So an example would be David programmed in a 20-minute EMOM, so every minute on the minute of certain exercises, or doing like a 5-round circuit for time. And so those were able to kind of push my limits mentally, physically, and just kind of switch up the training a little bit more. And then for the 3rd day of cross training would be a little bit more active recovery day with some more mobility work and some higher rep circuits for endurance strength training. And then recovery days, I would usually do a mile or 2 of a walk with my husband, either some gentle yoga, stretching, or mobility, and some naps. Naps are always perfect on Sundays. And that was more about my cross training. So a little bit of a snapshot for you. And then training for a race, as for those of you that have done races or are kind of in that sphere, training for a race is more than just running and exercise. Just as recovery plays a role, so does nutrition, and it's a very important role when it comes to your training. So while training for this race, in general, I eat a primarily whole food diet, dairy-free, gluten-free, for the most part. And I began eating a little bit more moderate amounts of carbs when I was training. And I think, honestly, it was because I felt like I needed to. But the carbs that I chose to eat were more sweet potatoes. I had rice cakes every once in a while with like avocado or something like that. And then starchy vegetables as well, and just packing on the vegetables. So that was specifically where I was at for some of my nutrition. And that's just how I feel comfortably and feeling like I can train and show up for the way that I run. And then nutrition specific for some of my longer runs. So runs that were longer than 9 miles, I would use dates for more of that kind of fast, simple carb, high energy type things to have. So rather than having some of the the chews or some of those different little gummies or goo packs and stuff like that. I personally just feel better having whole food. And so I would have dates. And so I would have about 2 that I would bring for my runs. And I would tend to start the first one at around mile 6 or 7, kind of depended on how I felt, but you don't want to have them too early on in the run because you really don't need it. And so later on in the runs, I would go ahead and have a date to help with some of that energy stores, but not necessary. But if you're training for halves, fulls, and some of those higher mileage races, you want to make sure that you're replenishing in some way. And so I just appreciated the dates. They also think for training hydration, so making sure you're getting enough water. By training during the summer, it's hot, so make sure that you're really getting enough water and making sure that you're actually getting the right electrolytes as well. So you could be drinking a ton of water, but if you don't have a right electrolyte balance, you're just going to be excreting it out through urine. And so you can kind of do the urine pee color test and see when you go to the bathroom, take a look and see kind of what color things are. If they're extremely pale or very watery and you feel like you just had a ton of water, but you still are feeling dehydrated, you might want to add some salt to your water. Or I'll talk you through one of the electrolyte drinks that I like to make. Or if it seems very concentrated and very yellow, that you are most likely dehydrated and it's a really concentrated type of urine. So that you want to make sure that you're getting enough water. I like to recommend getting at least half your body weight in water a day. So in ounces. So half your body weight of water in ounces per day. And if you're running, you want to be increasing that even more so. And then for those of you women that are also breastfeeding, if you're running, you want to make sure that you're getting even more than that, because that is also very important when you're breastfeeding and doing exercise to stay hydrated. So I'm going to share my electrolyte drink that I like to have, especially on those hot days coming back from runs. So I would do 1.5 to 2 cups of water, juice of a lemon. So you could do half of a lemon or a full lemon, depending on taste. And then at least a 1/4 teaspoon of pink Himalayan salt. Honestly, you could do a little bit more. And then a little squirt of honey and mix it up. You can put them all in a jar, shake it up a little bit, and then go ahead and enjoy it. And it can be stored in the fridge for up to a week. And I find that pint jars work really well because then you can kind of shake it up in there and you can still close it if you don't finish the drink. So that's a little bit more on some of the training nutrition that I did. And then for race day, I had water and coconut water during the actual race. So I had water stations, stations. My husband was my moving water station. So he was at mile 3, mile 6, mile 10, and then right at the end at 13. So I had water for mile 3 and a little bit at mile 6 I had water, and then I had a little bit of coconut water. So that's more for some of those simple carb to restore and get some of those simple sugars. And then I had at mile 10 for the water station or running with Dave during that little bit of mile 10, I had some more coconut water and then water as well. And then also I had 2 dates with me that I took. I actually only had one during the race because I just felt like I didn't need it. I think some of it was because I was having the coconut water too. But for the actual race, just making sure, I recommend starting with just straight water at least up to, the first 1/4 of the distance. Depends on also the day, the weather. For me, the morning was actually pretty humid, but it wasn't too hot. I was running really early in the morning, so the sun wasn't actually out yet, which was good. So just be mindful of that too when you're preparing for those races, and to not slug water. Otherwise, you're going to really be feeling it in your stomach. And that all comes with learning. So a lot of this stuff is trial and error when it comes to nutrition with running. Our bodies digest things differently. They process things differently. depending on how you feel, be aware of some of those foods that might irritate your stomach. I had one training run that I had a decent amount of like nut butter or like a fatty food before, a few hours even before the run. And during the run, I just got like a terrible side ache. So learning from experience, I was like, okay, don't do that next time, because that was really uncomfortable. And I felt like I couldn't run as fast as I should have been. So find out what those foods are for you, and then be smart about it when you have your training runs to either not eat those or save them for another time, or less quantity is another one. And then after my actual race, I had an egg and veggie scramble and a gluten-free tortilla and some coffee. And that in general, I know a lot of times after big races, we want to like indulge and eat a bunch of other stuff. And at least given the COVID season, most restaurants weren't open. So I made my own food, and it was something that I felt was good for my recovery, and I felt good eating it. And I didn't also feel like super bloated or anything after, which for me, that's important. I want to feel good, and I want to enjoy the food that I'm eating. So with that nutrition stuff, I found that my training, I felt strong. My body was less bloated. And I actually leaned out a little bit, especially noticing that more around like my face. And I believe that was to reducing the foods with added sugar into my diet, which I wasn't regularly eating, but I also wasn't avoiding them at the same time. I tend to be an accommodator when it comes to social settings and always willing to try a new food. And through God's grace and that global pandemic, that allowed me to be more intentional with my nutrition choices, which I believe helped me with my training and overall mindset. So I was eating cleaner and eating more whole foods and training as well. So that combination was a really good sweet spot for my body. I felt really, really confident and strong in kind of what I was doing. So also, I want to preface that I was not perfect while training. I still enjoyed some treats here and there, had some wine, but in general, finding a nutrition plan that works for you can make all the difference. By fueling your body with the right nutrients, and the amount of food was so critical for me with my training and for my recovery. So that was a little bit more about the nutrition side of things. And I wanted to share a little bit more about the goal that I had for the actual distance. So I mentioned before I was working on a little bit more of that speed work. So initially my goal was to do my race in 1 hour and 45 minutes. So that would be an 8-minute mile pace. As I was training, I came to realize that my speed was just shy of reaching that goal. And so thinking about when you're doing goal setting, I'm thinking about SMART goals. So if it's sustainable, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. So I tweaked it to a goal that was at 1 hour, 47 minutes, and 30 seconds, which was an 8:12 pace on average. And that, I think, was when I chose that goal, was a little bit more realistic, because my pace was similar to that, but it was just pushing the limits. So I wasn't picking something that was going to be easy, but it was still something that I believe I was able to attain. So on the actual race day, I completed my half marathon in 1 hour, 47 minutes, and 52 seconds with an average pace of 8 minutes and 14 seconds per mile. So I was so close to my goal, but it was still a PR, which I was very impressed with, given the fact that I was running pretty much by myself, minus a few little stints of time when my husband was with me with my moving hydration station. But in general, so running on my own, I didn't run with music. I chose not to. I wanted to have just quiet time while I was running, pushing myself mentally, or sometimes I think we can numb ourselves with listening too much to music or getting distracted. I wanted to really focus on my breathing and focus on pushing myself mentally. So I was still really happy with the results and with that whole process. So everyone has a journey when they decide to train for a longer distance running adventure. And I hope you were able to gain some insight into my latest training program from the perspective of a doctor of physical therapy and a novice runner, and to learn more about what should be included from an individualized program. So an individualized strength program, appropriate running mileage and training, nutrition, hydration, and recovery. So again, if you guys have any questions, I would be happy to share more specifically on that. Or if you're interested in learning more about our Inside Out Resilient Running program. Most runners don't know how to increase miles and improve running performance without experiencing annoying overuse injuries. With the Resilient Running program, you'll learn how to improve your running performance long-term by allowing you to get stronger, run faster, and avoid nagging injuries and setbacks. If you're interested in learning more about our Resilient Running program, check out the link in the show notes, and we'd be happy to get connected with you and get you started on a plan today. So again, I would like to thank you for listening today and learning more about my journey with long distance running. And again, reach out with any questions, and I look forward to the next episode, and I'll talk to you ladies soon. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Postpartum Performance Podcast. I appreciate you taking the time to listen, learn, and grow. If this is your first time tuning in, thank you so much for being here. The aim of this podcast is to provide oodles of the best possible content to help empower women, eliminate the phrase, "I wish I would have known sooner" around pelvic health, and to encourage personal growth through the postpartum journey to becoming the best version of yourself. If you enjoyed the show and found the content helpful, please remember to subscribe to the podcast and leave a 5-star review. These subscriptions and reviews help other mothers discover the podcast. If you're a regular listener, thank you. I encourage you to tell a friend about us or post on social media sharing your favorite part for today's show. If you're looking for more content like this, please follow me on Instagram at Postpartum Performance. Remember, mothers, if you're seeking to live life strong, I'm here with you in your corner. Continue to be brave, stay strong, and live confidently.